This episode we're going to be talking about Jennette McCurdy's book, I'm Glad My Mum Died. Jennette is a former Nickelodeon child star. I actually didn't know anything about her. I actually hadn't even heard her name until I started seeing all the publicity around this book. And I was a little bit apprehensive. Obviously, celebrity memoirs do not have very good track records, shall we say. And obviously you've also got this layer of I don't know about you, but I find when a book is so incredibly hyped, it makes me suspicious. Anyway, Jennette's book or memoir talks about her life between the ages, I get the impression it's kind of earliest memories, but I would say it's between the ages of, I think, 6 and 27 or 28. So it describes her experience as a child star at Nickelodeon. There are kind of unnamed figures, adult figures at Nickelodeon who she described as being quite abusive. The book centres around the abuse she experienced at the hands of her mother, who then, when Jennette was 25 or 26, then died of cancer. So the focus really is the mother, but there are all kinds of other things that she struggles with. Obviously, it's one of those things. I'm no psychoanalyst, but you definitely get the impression that a lot of her issues, so she also suffers from eating disorders, a lot of them are, in some cases, given to her by her mother, and in some cases just are kind of the effect of such a traumatic childhood, such traumatic formative years. So in case it isn't already obvious, it's a book that is filled with trauma. And obviously, if you're someone who feels like these kinds of topics aren't things that you would like to read, or you think they might be triggering, then ignore what I'm about to say. But I do think that this book is very important, and anyone who feels capable of doing so should read it. And in this video, I'm going to explain why. First of all, it's incredibly well written, and despite the challenging subject matter, it's pretty much impossible to put down. The pace is really, really good, and you can just tell that, I mean, she talks about it in the book, but she was a child actor, but she actually always wanted to be a writer. And you can tell that she is a very talented writer, because so many of the very complex things that are described in it are described so well. I just feel like a lot of the aspects, when she's describing her abuse, but also her feelings, they're expressed so clearly. So in that sense, it's kind of not a challenging book to read, just because of how good a writer she is. I also just think, and a part of why I recommend it, is it teaches very valuable lessons in grief, but also just in pain and in dealing with these kind of traumatic things that Jennette dealt with. I lost my mum to cancer when I was 18. So in that sense, I relate, these descriptions of grief and some of the maybe uglier feelings around grief, and the book is very raw. So that's a really refreshing thing. You kind of get a bit of a no bullshit description of, I guess just the ugliness of human emotion. But then there are other things within the book. She was a child star on Nickelodeon, so already you can imagine that there is a huge amount that I don't directly relate to. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, as someone who relates to some of it and not other aspects of it, which I'm sure is most people, I think most people, unfortunately, will relate to some of the terrible things that she experienced, but maybe not others. So from that perspective, it was so good at the things you relate to, it kind of expresses well, and it sort of makes you feel less isolated. And then the things you don't relate to, again, because it's so well expressed, I feel like it's just informative. It really educates you and helps you kind of exercise empathy and really understand what it's like to struggle with something like that. I just think it's really excellent in that sense. And why I think I've seen like critics describe it as this, but why it's such a kind of important book. And I agree with that. I think it's a really important book because it just explores these things so thoroughly without ever feeling clinical. Another thing that really struck me was that before I read it, the media but yeah, I saw a lot of media around it being a funny book, and I even saw the odd commentary YouTuber talk about how it made them laugh out loud, and that I've seen a few other reviews that mention laughing out loud, and that was something that really shocked me when I read it. I did not find it remotely funny. That's not to say Jennette isn't a funny person. You can tell there is a humorous tone throughout the book, and I think that tone actually helps her get across the more honest, slightly more uncomfortable messages around how she's feeling, because she's just very dry, I guess. So she's got this dry tone that is humorous but also opens the door to this kind of level of honesty that maybe wouldn't have otherwise been possible. So yeah, you can tell that she is a humorous person, and then that's also reflected in interviews. But I was very shocked reading it because I had in mind that it would be funny in parts because that's what I'd kind of been told. But I just found it so upsetting that it was impossible for me to find it funny, especially, as I said, the book follows her between the ages of 6 to 27. And so for the vast majority of the focus of the book is describing someone who is a teenager or a young adult. And those types of people at that age, you're incredibly vulnerable. And I just thought that when someone is that young and going through so many terrible things, I just couldn't find anything funny in the book. I could sense maybe there was a bit, as she grew older, as she was kind of 25, 27 and starting to get better, I guess maybe I could see some parts that some people might find funny. And obviously because she's where she is now, and because she's in a place where she's slightly healed, I guess that allows you to look at this book with hindsight, even though it's kind of first person point of view. Because you do have that hindsight, I guess you can laugh a bit. Because I saw Jennette actually talk about it in an interview. It was in her interview with Drew Barrymore. I think Drew, who's been through something similar, said that she really appreciated her humour around the topic. And then Jennette said she doesn't trust people who are totally serious because life isn't doom and gloom. It's messy and it's both. And that, she's completely correct on that part. And I also think if you're the person going through it, you definitely can find humour in those moments. So I completely get it, but I just found it interesting as like a reader having a window into this life. The idea that it was funny, it was lost on me. So as I briefly mentioned as well, the book was written with a very strong kind of first person point of view and voice. And this was really, I think it was a huge part of why the book has been so successful. So the point of view, when she was 6 and when she was a lot younger, although she was using hindsight to kind of highlight certain thoughts and highlight certain instances that got a point across that was a bit more sophisticated maybe than like her thought process at the time, the language that was used was that of a 6-year-old, and it was definitely still like in the voice and in the mind of the 6-year-old and the 12-year-old and the 15-year-old. So the voice and the writing matched the age that she was at the time. And I think a part of why this was so important to this book and why it really struck me was because, first of all, it gave this like heightened sense of empathy. It really reminded you, with every terrible thing happening to Jennette, it kept you constantly aware of her age at the time and of how vulnerable she was. And it also allowed you to see how, in some ways, how little the voice changed as she got older, and how she had actually been stunted by, you know, what she went through, and the voice reflected that. So yeah, I just, that way of writing was just very, very emotive and really, really kind of has stayed with me. And finally, this tone of voice got across the insidiousness of the abuse so well, because although, you know, throughout the book she describes like really overt acts of abuse, you also have these constant reminders of things like, it describes her desperation to keep her mum happy, and that's a repeated theme actually throughout the book, is this feeling of just want to keep her happy. And I think that's one thing that it might be easy to forget about the impact of. You know, it's like if you're experiencing this type of relationship, it isn't just these big blowouts or acts of awfulness. It's the constant, very ingrained fear that stops you from sort of living your life. And she just gets that across so well. And especially it was almost, again, it was just extra emotive, this feeling of like, as a reader, you know what's going on, but the child tone of voice just really reminds you that they have no idea what's going on. And then later when it described, literally by the time she's kind of, when she's like early mid-20s, she's still, the penny hasn't really dropped as to what her mother was really like. And it does actually describe a scene where she's in therapy where she kind of describes like stuff that her mother did, and the therapist is like, that's not okay, basically. And I think the therapist specifically describes it as abuse, and Jennette obviously kind of shuts down and like hates that suggestion. And that's kind of where it starts to unravel. But up until literally her kind of mid-20s, you can see, because of this angle, because of this point of view, you can really see how she's been affected. You're really, as a reader, waiting for her to realise and waiting for her to be kind of, I guess, set free and begin her journey of healing. So yeah, there are just so many aspects that gets across, like the complexity of these types of relationships. Now, moving on to the depiction of grief, the first thing, and I say the first thing because the book starts with this. The first thing I noticed was how it describes life before and after. So you open and the first page literally is before, and that's the kind of part one of the book. And then actually when I opened it and saw there was a before, I was like, oh, there must be an after. And looked to see if there was an after. Like, I've always, like, to myself, considered life BC and AC, as in like before cancer and after cancer. And it's not just life you consider that way, it's yourself. Like, it's who you are before and after these actually very distinct events. Because I think there are very few things that kind of sever your life the way that something as like traumatic as the death of someone close to you do. I just found it really interesting. Like, it must be a very universal way of viewing things, this before and after. So that was a little tidbit that I just enjoyed. But then the main thing that I really got from I'm Glad My Mum Died, that I really enjoyed, was the ugliness of emotions and some of the emotions she had, and how incredibly honest she was about having these emotions. I think people are bad enough at talking about grief in the most abstract way, or even in just a kind of rose-tinted way. Like, I think people are awkward enough talking about it, even if it's just the normal even if it's not the normal emotions, even if it's kind of the palatable emotions, I guess. So like sadness, it's like, okay, sadness, that's fine, we can deal with sadness. But the moment you're feeling something like anger or relief, which is obviously an emotion that really comes across with the title of this book, the moment you're feeling those things, it's like so taboo. and so not spoken about. And that's just something else I really enjoyed about this book, how much anger she felt around her mum's illness. You know, she craved seeing her mum behave essentially in quite awful ways, because that showed that she was well. Because if her mum ever became vulnerable or kind of soft, I guess, that was kind of an acceptance of her illness, and it was an acceptance that she was kind of, you know, it was her just not being herself because she was dying. And so these moments of her mum not being controlling and not being manipulative, which were pretty few and far between, but these moments actually made Jennette incredibly angry because she just wasn't being normal. And I think that is hugely relatable, how much anger, like, people just don't talk about how much anger you feel around grief and how that's actually incredibly normal. So I loved the mention of that, and she kind of repeatedly talks about it actually. And then this is towards the end of the book, but she reflects on, you know, why we romanticize the dead. And this was a point that I thought about quite a lot. I feel like not only is it just kind of nice to, but romanticizing the dead and kind of putting them on a pedestal, I think though people would be less willing to admit it, it is also just a way of kind of nicely packaging their grief and making it easier to deal with. So making the grief less complicated. You know, if you romanticize people, not only is it just like, oh yay, I can look back on them only in a positive way, but it also just gives you kind of less to think about. You're able to just be like, these were those happy things, box ticked, nice reflections, goodbye. Did that make sense? Whereas the reality is, even if you have had a really positive relationship with the person that's died, no relationship is perfect, and there will always be things that feel like they're unsaid, or like frustrations. That's just the reality of human relationships. And grief obviously provides you with like absolutely no outlet or absolutely no opportunity to evolve that relationship, maybe make some things better, or maybe just mature a certain aspect of a relationship. And that kind of very brutal stopping of that through the person dying is just very jarring, I think. And so that's what I was thinking when talking about romanticizing the dead. I feel like that's kind of why it's a part of why we do it. Because it kind of puts the grief in a more manageable box. And another thing that I think, and again is a kind of key message of Jennette's book that was really important, was that just because someone is dying or is dead does not mean they're a good person. And it's very hard to feel validated in that feeling. You can see that people are kind of unwilling to let you have that feeling. It makes people very uncomfortable. But this is why I think the title of the book had to be what it was, because it kind of opens up that discussion. I think obviously the title was meant to be provocative, and I'm sure has allowed it to garner a bit more media attention than if it was kind of just Jennette McCurdy, a memoir. But I also think that is the kind of ultimate message of the book, put very concisely, but I really appreciate it for its straightforwardness and how it so accurately reflects the book and Jennette's tone throughout. So I'm gonna leave you with that note. Let me know what you think of the book and what you think of what I think of the book, and then I'll let you know what I think of what you think of what I think of the book. Thank you for joining. I hope to see you in the next one. I really enjoyed this slightly more relaxed setup. I hope you have a lovely day and that you're looking after yourself. Goodbye.